Hello and welcome to another episode of Let's Talk Security Testing. I'm your host, Tom Ballin, and I'm joined today by Christine. Christine, do you want to give a little introduction to yourself?
Sure. So I am currently a senior security engineer at a company called Andela. Made my way up in the field from being a junior engineer, overseeing a bug bounty program, and then overseeing the entire security program at a company called Clearco. And now moved back into being an individual contributor role and working quite closely with the devs and the infrastructure engineers to hopefully improve the security posture of our company. And yeah, that's largely me from a professional standpoint.
Cool. Well, perfect. Yeah, I'm looking forward to today's episode. We're hopefully going to touch a little bit on some of your experiences around things like the bug bounty, the implementing and identifying the right kinds of testing for the organisation, and also hopefully some of your experiences of where security tools and operations might work for some parts of the business but might not work for others, and how you overcome some of those problems. But I guess a good place to begin is, when you're actually going out and looking at what it is that you need as an organisation, what kinds of testing might be appropriate for the organisation, and what what are the factors that you look at there, and how do you actually go about doing that initial exercise?
Sure, and I think for me, you then quite quickly come across the distinction between your pen testing or your bug bounty, and the very manual processes that you want someone with that specific skill set to work on. And then there's the scanning tools themselves. So, like the code security, the cloud CSPMs. I suppose we should describe what acronyms are for the cloud security posture management. There we go. I haven't forgotten that one. And that space has really just exploded in the last few years. I remember back in the day, you can talk about code security or scanning, and you had SAST and DAST, and now how many acronyms are we up to there? But I do think, as part of an internal security team, we will typically have the skill set to have that code scanning in place. And whether you're using open source or more often than not a paid vendor to scan on a continuous basis, like the cloud, the code, the infrastructure, you then do, like I've often found, and that's why I'm quite grateful to have started overseeing the bug bounty program, that often it's those manual testers, but this also makes you quite uneasy at times. It's often the manual testers with that quite specific skill set who will find things that weren't picked up in the scans, or with the scans you can only configure them as well. It's like or that then links back into engineer education and awareness. That I think in any organisation, the two places I've seen the highest impact vulnerabilities caught, either bug bounty or internal engineers who come to you saying, like, this thing is happening, thought you might, not sure if you want to know, but thought you might want to know. And it's like, yes, we do want to know. So I think from my perspective, not sure how spot on that was with the question, but when I sort of survey the lay of the land, there's like the best way, like the most comprehensive, because we love that word in security, or at least vendors do. If it exists, that would be lovely. But my approach would be, the engineers need to know call it best practices, call it what like security actually looks like. You then do need your scanning tools in place, but that's kind of like I've rarely found scans finding the high impact issues. And then bug bounty, which manual testing, I don't know, can that be defined as DAST, can it not? That's...
So obviously, the different tools and the different technologies, they have different capabilities. You mentioned some of the better findings coming out of things like bug bounty programs. But is it fair to say that, can you compare them? Would you, do you find yourself leaning towards more one versus another, or is it more that you want to sort of build up the layers of these different tools, so because they've got different uses?
I definitely think, you need to build up the layers. I mean, if we're playing buzzword bingo, like the defense in depth and layered security for sure. Like you wouldn't want to just be relying on one thing, and that's where in a program, I feel more secure if something that's caught by one pillar can then be backed up by the others. Like there's a bug bounty submission. You can go look in your scan and identify what in the rule set didn't catch that, open admin portal. So what are we not scanning for from our internal network, which would pick up, whatever the end of the URL there or whatever the parameter is that would give that away as an admin portal. Why was that not in the rule set? And then to make sure, like, if you can see on more than one of your systems where, like, traces of that vulnerability, then that's what makes, I feel like that gives away that's a more mature security program. Otherwise, like, if you are just catching on one, like, better catch on one than none. But if you can't validate that across, and I mean, that's the logic of a SIM as well. I know, again, now more internal than the testing and the defensive, offensive side, more defensive than offensive. But in a SIM, you want to see that behavior or that activity correlated across different data sets.
Mm-hmm.
So the more that you have in place, the better that's going to be, of course.
And I know, speaking, from a vendor's perspective, I often find it quite difficult to figure out what's actually out there to begin with. Even trying to discern what the competitor landscape is and what a tool is capable of doing versus what another tool is capable of doing, or across the market, which 5, 6, 12 tools you actually need to be able to do that. Is that a problem from your side? And other ways to how do you overcome that kind of a barrier?
That in itself, let me know if you figure it out. I do think, one thing that would do everyone a favour is if vendors worked out how to say what they did in the paragraph, and say, like, if there was with honesty saying who the competitors are, what others do, what they don't. But then once again, like, you can't rely on the sales pitch, and so I think you really build up. Like, if you get the sense of the lay of the land, and there's always something being added to that. But I do think, the reality is there's various tools that have established themselves and that you've worked with. Like, every engineer, like, whether it's security or not, will have their favourite tool that they know works. And as well, when it comes to things like switching or considering a new vendor, there's also a cost of education, like, if you move away. So to some extent, like, knowing how to use what you know, there's value in that. Then there's evaluating the cost that if there is something viably better, then also taking into consideration how long does it take to train yourself and the team on that. Once again, been said a million times, but if you do get a tool in place, it's useless if it's not configured correctly. And so I'm quite wary of buying a bunch of tools and they're not even configured or they're not integrated with wherever you have. So there is a level of knowledge for sure going in, and that's where one of the great things and the pros and cons of our industry is that when you're working inside of it, you can't really just take a step back. It's hard to sort of do the 9 to 5 and assume that you know enough to keep you going for the next 10 years. So maybe roundabout a way of answering it, but it's, I know that Ghana and all the rest of it try and do their thing where they, not heat map, but map, what are those called?
Magic quadrants sort of stuff.
Yeah, magic quadrants, and there is an attempt at that, but I don't think anyone's come up with a solid solution beyond just keeping on top of your game.
It's it's interesting, especially when you're talking about the operators and the education themselves, because that's one of the factors that's rarely talked about, at least in my experience, rarely talked about, is that you can build as brilliant a tool as you want in terms of finding vulnerabilities, right? But if everybody hates to use that tool, then it's going to be an uphill battle from the start. Not necessarily from a vendor's perspective. You might be able to sell it if you can find decision makers who aren't necessarily consulting with their team beforehand. But you give that to an operator, and that operator, no matter what promises the tools makes of being able to find things, that operator will very quickly make you realise that maybe it's not the not the right purchase.
No, and I think we've talked about this a bit before as well, that if it was an industry where you came away knowing more from every interaction, because like whether it's the vendors, internal security, leadership, if like I'm very much of the mentality that the less words you use, the more you say. Like people aren't absorbing every word from a half-hour vendor pitch.
Mm-hmm.
But if you came away after like 5-10 minutes with sharing a perspective or actually cutting out the marketing buzzwords, then I don't know, but that is a problem to be solved in the industry, that in many ways, like the onus is on yourself as a practitioner to keep yourself sharp and to keep educated. But I do suspect like the places that burnout come from within the industry, I know especially once you sort of get in, there's that mid-range of, well, you're in the industry, you have your maybe a few certifications or you have your degree, and then, well, what knowledge do you keep up with to stay sharp? And I think I'm almost thinking it's a bit problematic how many webinars there are out there, because you can watch any numerous ones and not come away with any of that impacting how you approach your day-to-day.
Mm-hmm.
But the education, I think, whether that's CTFs, but yeah, anyway, that's trying to get into a solution that I haven't fully worked out myself yet. But
and as somebody who's obviously trying to learn about the latest advancements and the latest technologies, and actually having been responsible both for identifying the capabilities and also for using the tools yourself, what are the lessons, are there lessons learned there? What are the kinds of things that, where are there shortcomings in what the market's currently producing? Or are there particular sort of frustrations that you find with some of these technologies where that rules them out of the equation, would you say?
That is a really good question. It's not the frustration of what isn't being covered. If I knew something that wasn't being covered, I'd probably I might keep that to myself and build a business around it. I think maybe one of the frustrations is that every company that once upon a time was known for doing one thing is now doing everything, and there's the companies doing it through acquisition. And I mean, it's nice to think of having a single pane of glass or having a one-stop shop and just needing one tool. But then the reality is, it's not simply a matter of, this company does this company does this vendor does this. It's now weighing up, you can get this, and it kind of does this, but then do you complement it as well with this?
It's your classic, I've got an E5 license, whatever, do I need to buy other things? And it's like, this tool is better at this thing, even though I have a foundation version.
Increasingly more complex landscape, and that's where even then sharing with engineers what they do. Because if you find a tool that engineers love using, then, you're in a good spot with that. But then if you're like, if you want this, you can go here, but you can also go here and here and here, and suddenly you've lost them. That's a strength and weakness that you kind of gain this defense in depth through tools that once upon a time we've only had one function, but then needing to the weighing that up of just how many do you need in place. And I don't think anyone's come up with a magic number for how many vendors and I don't know. I think the more as well, I'm of the mentality that the more you can do in-house, because the risk there is you develop something in-house, someone knows how to do it and they leave. But if you develop it in-house, document it, and then, because you want to know how to configure the tool, and if you make it in-house, there's a good chance that you're not actually making it if they don't have the skill set to deploy it. But I also know I've worked with engineering leads and managers and directors of engineering who say that unless you've been hands-on with this process, they don't want you to automate it. Tell me and show me the hours or the time that this tool will actually save the internal team, or they don't want to take anything on, which is going to cause more alerts and ask more time than the tool would take away.
So is that really the KPI or the key metric for a good security tool, the hours that it takes away from a person?
If we could measure that with every tool, I think it would be. But I think that's I think for the most part, security tooling doesn't unfortunately take hours of work away from devs. I don't know what I can name drop or not, trying to stay vendor agnostic here, but like the PRs and can I mention?
Yeah, you can mention vendors.
But I do mean things like Dependabot and scanning for out-of-date dependencies. That's the sort of thing that devs would be concerned with. The knowledge is there for them. They're not being forced to spend an hour a day updating these dependencies, but they're aware of it. And then you can have it so that the PRs are automated. And so that in itself is the example of something that can save time. And there's a lot of security where it's is that security or is that just taking care of technical debt? And that's where I think I've been quite lucky going into organizations. My default is also coming in through a security route without a background as a dev. I'm curious as well to learn as much by simulation as I can. So going in, and actually we've sometimes done the reverse of the security champion mentality of, instead of getting someone from each team and you're the security champion, you'll be trained up in security and you can be our proxy. The organizations have often been small enough that will implant a security engineer, in this case it's me, into the DevOps team. And then what you're really doing is you're learning what their priorities are, what their problems are, what's on their Kanban board, and recognizing, what here is security, but first of all, it's also one of their priorities. And you find that a lot of priorities actually do line up. So I know that's a little bit of a tangent away from the question of is saving time a KPI of security tools? If you can get there, that would be brilliant. But I think, unfortunately, that's often not the case.
So is it fair to say it's about process then, effectively, not necessarily saving time or not necessarily measuring the time that's been saved, but understanding the level of improvement that the tool can make to the current and existing processes, not even always security, but engineering processes as well?
I would say so, because especially if it can, if it can bring light to a situation, sort of illuminate, example of Dependabot, something that highlights the reason that, if you're not updating critical issues with dependencies, that things need to be updated. That's something that is unavoidable. And so if you have a tool that comes in here, basically allows you to see, to prioritize, have awareness of something that you should be doing anyway, and then ask, how do we make sure that this is just simply part of what we're doing, so we don't need to reactively, every time a high CVSS comes through, scramble to go get patched. How do we make sure that we're aware, okay, this is happening once a month? How do we integrate that into the process? Which in turn means that there's no mad scramble of communication to address something that's already happened. So I think if a tool brings insight and awareness and prompts maturity or gets the organization to the point where developing a more mature process is something that does save time, I think yes, which I think gets back to the previous question and answers that as a yes as well.
So how well are we doing on that front, would you say? I look at a lot of security tools and they are very much security tools. They're not developer friendly. They're not business friendly, really. They're designed for a bunch of hackers to use in a command line and to interpret the results because they're familiar with the language. Maybe that's an unfair representation. I think, in the last few years, like you mentioned, things like Dependabot's a good example of something that's been fairly developer friendly, and Snyk have, I think, done a strong job on that front as well, as of some of the CSPM providers to an extent. But would you say there's been a monumental shift, or are we still mostly lacking in that respect?
I do actually think they're doing quite well. So there are a lot of integrations with whichever Git repository that you're using, and sort of taking I don't know if it's accurate to say Dependabot's lead, because I don't know if they were the first, but there are a lot of tools that integrate back in and provide alerts without blocking anything. So that has been nice to see. But then I also think if I could swap out the vendor pitch for anything, it would be like short little informational sessions or training sessions on, I think there are companies that do this, but basically like this is what the tool looks like when it's up and running. And even from the security side, I know when like if people are moving from being an analyst, or if they don't have a background of working with the SDLC and like committing code, that's where everything starts. And I think if vendors could get out there and instead of like just talking our ear off about like why they're a silver bullet, get in and start doing 15-minute like training videos of like this is actually how it would integrate back. This is the sort of alerts it would show. Even this is the sort of impact this sort of vulnerability, if caught, could ultimately have on the organisation. Because I do think, they are moving in that direction, but I'd still like less noise when you're trying to figure out what a tool does, and more of it goes in here, it does this, it shows this, it avoids this.
Not to sound like an apologist for the vendors here, but one of the challenges I've found, I talk to organisations every single day about ways that we might be able to help improve their process in improving their security testing. But one of the things that we need to do in order to do that is integrate into their SDLC, right? Mm-hmm. And if you sit a company down and say, I need to understand at a very high level how you go from requirement for a new functionality of your application through to ticket, through to development, and actually it being deployed into production, then the conversation falls apart. It's not. I don't know how equipped vendors are to build out these training sessions because it's often difficult information to actually be able to glean out of the businesses that we're talking to.
That then links into another thing I'm quite familiar with, the translation that's needed when a pen testing firm asks for the scope from a business. So it's like the IP ranges, the number of applications, the API endpoints, and then explaining what that means to internal security team. Because I've been in companies mature enough that they know their CIDR ranges for each branch of the business. I've been in companies that don't know how to get the list of their endpoints, or they have their applications, but there's the internal ones, the external ones, the testing, production, and so on and so forth. And so actually that would be lovely, like a 15-minute little webinar on how do you actually find your scope, where can you typically reliably get your IP ranges from, because there is some translation that happens when you're looking at a business from the outside in, and when you're implanted in a dev or an engineering team, being like, well, they might know the answers, but then also communicating that to the person who's talking to the vendor regarding the SDLC and the processes there. You don't have to be in the industry long before you recognise them.
And a lot of that problem is just about the wrong people speaking to each other, right? If a pen tester was speaking directly to a dev or to an engineer, then it would be a much easier process than this sort of roundabout pen tester speaking to an account manager, speaking to a CISO, or these days maybe information security manager, and then passing that back and forth between the teams to try and get to that. Trying to get to that understanding, rather than the people who speak the same languages speaking at each of those layers. Yeah,
but then even then there might be and I remember that was one of the delightful things realising in the first couple of years of my career. Also just where I was working with, SonarQube, and integrating that into Jenkins at the time. And the builds were failing, and reaching out to the devs, being like, oh, do you have any insight why these builds are failing? They were like, what? And sort of grappling in the dark to feel like, wait, where does my knowledge end and yours begin? And so that's even depending on what sort of an engineer you're working with, like product or infrastructure. They may have an awareness of where to get the IP ranges and the endpoints and the API endpoints, or they may not. So I still feel like there's a curious little game there of working out like how far your knowledge is, how far another person's knowledge is. But this is also like the startup world, so I imagine larger organisations probably have more of an awareness of who their designated person for knowing certain things are. In the startup world, it's whoever gets there first.
So, at a high level, then,
Yeah.
building a sort of a solid security testing product
Mm-hmm.
isn't about building a silver bullet. It's about identifying where the gaps
Mhm.
that an organisation might have testing are, and building something that improves the processes around that.
Mm-hmm.
But also not just building a product, but also
Mhm.
building a knowledge base behind it. That means that those engineers and those developers and those operators can
Yeah.
actually come in and access and use that system that you've built for the purpose that it's supposed to be built for.
I'd say that sounds like a pretty good product.
Cool.
If you go in, it gives you awareness. You can use a very like user friendly, which of course like anything that's not like you can't understate the importance of user friendliness and security. Otherwise, people won't use it. And then if it does provide awareness and education, like you go in for a simply functional purpose. But if you come away if you spend more time, you can come away with more information, then everyone wins.
Perfect. Well, look, thanks so much for coming in and having a conversation.
Absolutely.
In terms of our next episode, we're going to be talking about how to run an enterprise security testing program. You can find us on YouTube, Amazon Music, Spotify, and Apple Music. Thanks everybody for listening.